I'm delighted to be here this morning to share with you a little bit about this recently published book, which has the subtitle, Why Some Children Struggle and How All Can Thrive. My plan is to do about a 10-minute reading from the introduction to the book. Then I'm going to give you about a 30-minute lecture about the science on which the book is based. And then I'd love to open it up for questions and answers. So let me begin by reading you a few paragraphs from the introductory chapter of the book. What if the children about whom we worry most were actually those with the greatest promise? What if those youth whose lives are marked by turmoil and difficulty were plausibly heirs to the brightest, most creative futures? What if seemingly blighted and troubled childhoods could give way under conditions of encouragement and support to adulthoods bearing not simply normal lives and passable achievement, but deep, rich relationships and an inspired accomplishment? What if even the very real burdens of a child's uncommon fragility could be reshaped under responsive conditions into the tangible advantages of human resilience? What if, in short, the apparent frailties and disarray of some young lives were redeemable through the alchemy of nurturing families or communities and transformative care? This book is the story of just such a surprising redemption. It is a narrative mined from a body of child development research and from a near lifetime of careful watching by a once young pediatrician who became, by blessing and luck, a father, a grandfather, and in the end, a grizzled and well-marinated counselor of children and families. The story, at once personal and scientific, is offered as a gift of encouragement and hope for all those who teach, protect, care for, raise, or worry over children, as well as those who have struggled since childhood to understand the origin of their own affliction with human differences. If your life resembles my own to any degree, you have fretted incessantly over your children's well-being and future and have long pondered their strivings and trials, how they may stem in some manner from your own. You have likely thrilled at their triumphs and masteries, lived for their affections, taken pride in their accomplishments, and brooded over their troubles and sorrows. But the pain of a parent whose son or daughter has gone seriously adrift into drug abuse, delinquency, depression, or allegiances to destructive friendships is anxiety of an entirely different order. Watching as a child strays perilously off course, and begins to sustain the feared, often indelible consequences of departure from a healthy life is the kind of parental apprehension that is almost physically sensed. It is the pit in the stomach, the panicked, slightly nauseous desperation and dread that disallows sleep, becomes a preoccupation at work, and can erode even the strongest of marriages through miscommunication, acrimony, and disappointment. Watching a child slip away into the dark territory of serious psychological troubles, addiction, school failure, or criminality is an agony almost beyond description. Though never having sustained this level of worry as a parent, I have had a direct and indelibly memorable encounter with such anguish throughout much of my life because of my sister, about whom more is to follow. Among the most fervent ambitions of this book is to offer solace and hope to just such anguished families, to the parents, teachers, siblings, and others who have lost their confidence in the retrievable promise of a child or children, and to those whose belief in a child's inherent goodness and potential has been shaken. For in the story of the figure of speech from which this book draws its enigmatic title, the metaphor of the orchid and the dandelion, lies a deep and often helpful truth about the origins of affliction and the redemption of individual lives. Most children in our families, classrooms, or communities are more or less like dandelions. They prosper and thrive almost anywhere they're planted. Like dandelions, these are the majority of children whose well-being is all but assured by their constitutional hardiness and strength. But there are others, however, who, more like orchids, can wither and fade when unattended by caring support, but who also, like orchids, can become creatures of rare beauty, complexity, and elegance when met with compassion and kindness. While a conventional but arguably deficient wisdom has held that children are either vulnerable or resilient to the trials of the world that the world presents to them, what our research and that of others has increasingly revealed is that the vulnerability-resilience contrast is a false or at least misleading dualism. It is a flawed dichotomy that attributes weakness or strength, frailty or vigor to individual subgroups of youth and obscures a deeper reality that all children simply differ like orchids and dandelions in their susceptibilities and sensitivities to the conditions of life that surround and sustain them. Most of our children can, like dandelions, thrive in all but the harshest, most bestial circumstances. But a minority of others, like orchids, either blossoms beautifully or wane disappointingly, depending upon how we tend and spare and care for them. This is the redemptive secret of the story that the story herein reveals, that those orchid children who founder and fail can as easily become those who enliven and thrive in singular ways. In the end, it is not the vulnerability, but the sensitivity that defines the orchid. And given the right support, that sensitivity can blossom into lives of great joy, success, and beauty. As I map out the defining feature of orchid lives, I will also reflect upon those of us more aligned with a dandelion's way of being, and will take note of how essential, how vital such individuals are to what George Eliot referred to as the growing good of the world. Though distinctive in several dimensions, dandelions have their own life struggles and challenges that will be important to understand and define. We will also discover that beneath the serviceable categories of orchid and dandelion lies the truer reality of a continuum, a spectrum of sensitivities to the world along which we all have a place. In the end, it will be the remarkable complementarity of orchids and dandelions that we will want to sustain and remember. The usefulness and often love of the one for the other, the symmetry and mutuality of their symphonic roles in human discourse and history, and their coevolution as distinctive but equally cogent solutions to the deep dilemmas life calls forth. More illustrative of the broader concerns of this book, however, is the reality that it is the children of our societies who are the most sensitive and susceptible of all those who lack power, the most dependent among those who rely vitally upon grace and beneficence for survival. It is our children who are incapable of providing for themselves, who cannot stand alone without protection or help, who are the most vulnerable to the failings and indiscretions of nations. Though orchid children are, as we will see in the pages to come, those especially responsive and tender to the manner in which we treat and protect our young. At the larger scale of human societies and populations, it is all children who are the orchids of the world. So that gives you a little bit of a sense of where I'm headed this morning and where the book heads overall. So I want to now share with you some of the scientific basis, the scientific story out of which the book grew. So the orchid and the dandelion, why some children struggle and how all can survive. I am a sailor of small boats, among other callings, and when I'm out on that brisk blue San Francisco Bay, I am really attuned to the surface conditions of the water that control the balance and the direction of my boat, things like wind direction and speed, the surface chop and swells, the frequency and size of those, and these local tidal flows that, as you know, flow into and out of the bay. But interestingly, there are these other deeper and more powerful currents that move on a much larger scale around and through all of the oceans of the world. And these are these deep oceanic currents. The French theologian and sociologist Jacques Ellul argued that there are the equivalents of these deep currents that are operating within individual human lives, these kinds of more powerful, more potent underlying forces that guide the direction of our individual lives. And one such current for me has been my work for over 40 years as a pediatrician focused on children and young families who are facing major trauma and adversity. But there is another, perhaps more powerful deep current, oceanic current in my life that has been there for an even longer period of time than my professional career. And that deep current is captured by this little snapshot of a couple of young children at a Southern California beach sometime in the 1950s. The 7-year-old boy on the right here is me, and on the left is my 5-year-old sister Mary. Mary and I were the best and closest of friends for the first 10 years of our lives. We were matched in temperament and in imagination and energy and interest. We were each the other's best playmate, and we lived very closely parallel lives for that first decade of both of our lives. But as we approached puberty and early adolescence, there began a divergence that was really profound and important in both of our lives. I embarked on a life of what I think of as almost shameful good fortune. I had a gratifying and productive and rewarding professional career. I'm part of a stable 45-year marriage to that young woman right there. And we have 2 thriving children and 4 young grandsons. So a life of almost embarrassing good fortune. But by contrast to that, my sister's life became mired in a seemingly unending procession of misfortunes and afflictions. She developed a disabling chronic disease at the age of 11. After that, she began to develop a variety of profound mental health symptoms and carried a diagnosis of schizophrenia by the age of 20. During graduate school, she sustained an accidental, unplanned pregnancy and delivered a birth asphyxiated child who became disabled. And really, I would characterize her life as one of ongoing severe mental disorder. And the questions that have thus plagued me for many, many years, for decades of my life, even farther back than my career in science, are these questions of why and how. How is it that 2 children conceived of the same parents, delivered into the same family, the same home, the same neighborhood, attending the same schools, how is it that those 2 children, matched in so many ways, can take off on life trajectories that are so very different? And what might we be able to do to help with that, to prevent that kind of departure? So we know that there are a lot of things that determine the differential health and illness between individual children or groups of children. We know that exposure to infectious pathogens are important. Physical toxins in the environment, like lead and other environmental toxins that kids can be exposed to. The nutritiousness of the diet that children receive. Access to health care, housing, exposures to violence, the kind of parenting that they receive, and so on. But what has been missing from this list for all of the years of studying child health and wellness, but has recently, in the last, I would say, 12 to 15 years, been added to this list of determinants of child health and well-being, and that is adversity and trauma, the exposures of children to these kinds of toxic stressors that are important determinants of health in young children. And these include all of these things that we think of as adverse childhood experiences: physical, emotional, and sexual maltreatment of a child, intimate partner or community violence, parental substance abuse or mental illness, the death of a parent or a caregiver, natural disasters like the fire that we had up north here last year, divorce and single parenthood, the incarceration of a parent, another way of losing a parent, and growing up in poverty and with an unemployed parent, and importantly, exposures to experiences of racism and social subordination as well. All of these are these things that we call adverse childhood experiences that have profound effects on child health and well-being. And we now know epidemiologically that 2/3 of children by the age of 16 have experienced at least one of these potentially traumatic events or adversities. So this is a highly, highly prevalent risk factor within the lives of children. I like to do the thought experiment of if everybody in the room smoked 3 packs of cigarettes a day, some of us would develop lung cancer and some of us wouldn't. And we would then regard lung cancer as probably a genetic disease, controlling the susceptibility of the person to lung cancer. And in effect, we would be right in a way, because the thing controlling the variation in lung cancer would be genetics, not the exposure to the tobacco pathogen that we know underlies many cases of lung cancer. So it turns out that the risk factors that are the most prevalent, that are the most universal within a human population, are the ones most difficult to detect. And that is why these exposures to adversity and trauma have gone unrecognized for so many years, because it is in fact so prevalent a risk factor for so many children. We know that exposures to adverse childhood experiences is stratified by socioeconomic status as well. This slide shows a bar graph of exposures to various kinds of environmental perturbations that are associated with declines in health, and divided by those children growing up in impoverished conditions like the ones on the left versus those growing up in middle-income families like the ones on the right. And you can see that for every single one of these risk factors, the density of housing, housing problems, the noisiness of the environment, the exposure to family turmoil and chaos, and exposures to violence either within the family or within the community. All of these are far more prevalent within impoverished families compared to middle-income families. Now, to be sure, they are not absent from the families, from the middle-class families of some children. You can see that there's a substantial level of exposure even in the middle-income children, but there's clearly this differential, this divide by socioeconomic status. So why do we care so much about these adverse childhood experiences? Well, we know now that they are really intimately connected, strongly connected, significantly connected to the health consequences of the child as the child grows older. This shows a bar graph relating ACEs scores, adverse childhood experiences, on the horizontal axis to lifetime history of depressive disorders and mood disorders on the vertical axis. And you can see that there is this stepwise monotonic graded association with children with more of these ACEs experiences having far more in the way of depression and mood disorders over long periods of time compared to children with few or none of these ACE experiences. So mental health consequences of adverse childhood experiences. We also know that these kinds of exposures impair development in those first important three years of life. Similarly here, this shows this stepwise gradient as the number of adverse childhood experiences increases. So does the percentage of children with developmental delays in the first 3 years of life. So a connection not only to health, but also to the normalness and the adequacy of development. Now, the things that happen in childhood, these adversities that happen in childhood, don't just stay in childhood. They actually move on into adulthood and affect our health for the remainder of our lives. So they echo down the decades of adult life. This shows, again, the same thing, adverse childhood experiences on the horizontal axis and cardiac risk factors on the vertical axis in the later years of life. So these adverse experiences in childhood project forward into the lives of adults as well. We also know that there are effects of early stress exposures on the actual neural structure of the brain. We don't know this as well in human children, but we certainly know it in animal models. This is taken from a mouse model, and this shows a normal neuron with the neuron body down here at the bottom and all of the dendrites and axon of the neuron extending up vertically in a control animal that was raised by his mother in normative conditions. By comparison to that, the one on the right, the neuron on the right, shows an animal that was stressed in early life by taking him away from his mother and examining the brain as a consequence of that major stressor in early life. And the neuron on the right, I think you can visibly see, shows diminished and simplified branching of the axon. It shows decreased attachment points along that axon, and it shows an overall shrinkage of the neuronal cell body down at the bottom. So visible effects, microstructural effects on the neurons that exist within the brain related to these early stress exposures. But there is this really interesting and well-kept secret about these associations that I've been showing you. Each one, you will have noticed, is a bar graph showing increasing levels of undesirable outcomes as the number of adverse events increase. But what it doesn't show are the individual data points, the data points of the individual human beings that underlie that bar graph presentation of that association. And here's what it looks like underlying that bar graph. These are the individual data points that similarly relate ACEs experiences to depressive symptoms over the course of childhood and adolescence. And what you can see is that there's this tremendous amount of variation. At every level of adverse childhood experience, there's a huge range of outcomes, ranging from kids who have lots of depression and mood disorders to kids who have almost none. So it is a powerful, statistically significant association. It's replicable. It's been repeated multiple times, but it is noisy in a sense. It looks like a shotgun hit the screen here. There's a tremendous amount of variation in the connection between adversity and health outcomes. And we began years ago in my lab and with my colleagues. We began to ask the question, what is that variation? What is that variability in developmental outcomes by adversity and social class? Is it noise? It seems to be noise, but might it also be, or rather be, the music? Might it actually be the headline that we ought to be looking at? Might it be the very thing in which the enigma is solved of why there is so much variation? So we began to think of this variability in children's responsivity to adversity and stress as being the target that we should be examining in greater detail and care. And we did that by bringing children into laboratory circumstances where they were presented with an examiner that they hadn't met before and asked to carry out a series of mildly stressful tasks, age-appropriate, ecologically valid tasks, things like putting a drop of lemon juice on the child's tongue, or asking the child to repeat back a series of digits that the examiner presented to the child, or asking the child to watch an emotion-evoking video clip. All of these sort of minor, just modest stressors that were enough to stress the child slightly and challenge the child, but without the child running out of the room. And while we were doing that, we were assessing the peripheral manifestations of these two principal stress response systems in the human brain. The cortisol system, which is the hypothalamic pituitary adrenocortical axis, which is responsible for the output of the stress hormone cortisol. It is this powerful stress hormone that has major effects on the immune system all over the body, on the cardiovascular system. It has major effects, and it is kind of the sine qua non of a stress response, the cortisol system. The second is the fight or flight system, and that is the autonomic nervous system that's responsible for the sweatiness that gets on our palms when we're nervous or under pressure, or tremulousness, or the acceleration in heart rate, dilation of pupils, and so on. So we were measuring these peripheral manifestations of these two primary central stress response systems in the human central nervous system. And let me show you what the data looked like. So for the vast, vast majority of our kids in these samples, their data in the course of these stressors in the lab, these standardized presentations to them, looked like the yellow data points here on the left. The vertical axis here is mean arterial pressure, the average between the systolic and the diastolic. And on the horizontal axis is basically time, the sequence of challenging tasks that they were asked to complete. And what you can see is that they all had relatively modest mean arterial pressures, no huge increases in blood pressure, and they had really very modest variability from one task to another. So this was a group of children that constituted 80% of the children that we studied and who had relatively low reactivity to these challenges that we asked them to complete. By contrast to that, the children with the purple data points on the right had a very different profile of responsivity to these challenges. Again, this shows mean arterial pressure as a function of adverse childhood of the challenging tasks. And it shows not only an increase in mean arterial pressure, but a lot of variation from task to task. So these were highly reactive children to these standardized challenges that we had within the lab. So we had now these very standardized measures of what the child's reactivity to stress looked like in the laboratory situation. So we could now take those measures and move them out into the real world, where children, of course, experience multiple episodes of stress and challenge and adversity in their week-to-week lives. And we could begin to ask questions about whether in naturally occurring low stress versus high stress conditions, what was the rate of behavioral disorders and respiratory disease and injuries, things of that kind. All of these things that we care a lot about in the health of young children. And we could begin to look at those in relationship to their naturally occurring stress exposure and to their measures of reactivity within the lab. And here's what that looked like. The kids with the yellow data points over on the left that you just saw in the previous slide, the ones with only modest reactivity to the challenges, in the real life, real world, they looked like this. The kids under low stress conditions and the kids under high stress conditions showed almost no difference. There was a little bit of a blip upward in the kids who were experiencing naturally occurring stressors in their actual lives, but it's really very little. And they both groups of kids had relatively modest levels of health perturbations. In contrast to that, the kids that I had shown you previously with the purple data points on the right here, under conditions of high naturally occurring stress, had these exorbitant rates of behavioral disorders, of respiratory diseases, colds, bronchitis, and so on, injuries. These kids had tremendous increases in the level of stress outcomes under conditions of high stress exposure. And this is what we had predicted would happen. We figured that the kids who showed us high stress reactivity in the lab would also have these massive increases in outcomes that we want to avoid under conditions of naturally occurring stress. What we had not anticipated, and we kept getting over and over and over again in the studies that we did, was the other purple data point shown here in the middle. These are the kids with high reactivity in the lab and low stress, highly nurturant, highly controlled circumstances within their family and school environments. And they didn't just have average levels of the health outcomes. They had the lowest of all of the children in the sample. So we had this group of highly reactive kids, the purple data points, who had either the worst health outcomes or the best health outcomes, depending crucially on the kind of social context in which they were being reared. They had either the worst outcomes or the best outcomes. They were like a Janus-faced god that could look in either direction. We began to call these kids with the yellow data plots Dandelion children. When I was presenting some of these data at Stanford years ago, at the end of the lecture, an old guy came up the middle of the aisle with a gnarly cane and shook his cane at me and said, "You're talking about Maskrosbarn." And I said, I am. I don't know what Maskrosbarn is. And he was Swedish. And he said, the Swedes have this idiomatic expression, Maskrosbarn, which means literally dandelion child. And what the Swedes mean by dandelion child is that there are these kids who, like the dandelion, can grow anywhere they're planted. They grow in fertile mountain fields. They grow in the cracks of the sidewalks that we walk on. They are so hardy that they can grow anywhere and prosper anywhere. So we began to think of these kids as dandelion children. And of course, we then had to begin thinking of the others as orchid children, orchidabarn. The children who, like the orchid, have either the most flourishing, best outcomes under conditions of nurturance and care, or wither and fade under conditions of stress and adversity. Now, we have been able to replicate these findings in a variety of animal models, ranging from Drosophila, the fruit fly on the left, to rhesus macaques on the right. And one of the interesting things about infant rhesus macaques is that they have these two behavioral phenotypes. Some of them, the minority of them, are these shy, kind of withdrawn little animals. Others, all of the others, are very outgoing, very exploratory, very aggressive young monkeys. And I had the great good fortune one year on sabbatical to be at the National Institutes of Health, where I studied this group of 40 or 50 rhesus monkeys who live in this natural 6-acre habitat that has vast amounts of land, and it has a pond in the middle of the habitat with an island and a bridge going over to the island. It's basically like a summer camp for monkeys. And right before I had arrived, they had gone through a very stressful period of time where, because they had to do renovation and reconstruction on the grounds of the habitat, all of these animals were confined for a 6-month period of time to a 200-square-foot cinder block building. It was where they went when it was thunder and lightning, and to get away from weather, basically. But they had to all be confined to this building for a period of 6 months. It was supposed to only be 2 months, but it, of course, grew into a 6-month period over time. And it was very stressful to these animals, and it caused an epidemic of inflicted violent injuries, one animal to another. And when we then could use this natural experiment to look at the rates of violent injuries among high and low reactive monkeys under the conditions of low stress in the summer camp versus high stress in the cinder block building. And here's what it looked like. It looked virtually identical to the way that these distributions looked like within groups of children. The high reactive monkeys, again, are the ones shown in the purple data points. They had either the very highest rates of violent injuries incurred from another of its troop mates, or they had the lowest rates of violent injuries under the conditions of quiescence and no stress. And of course, we now began to think of monkeys as dandelion monkeys and dandelion and orchid monkeys. So there seems to be a replicability of this, not just in human children, but in related species as well. So we have now gone on to study this. The way that we talk about this scientifically is as differential neurobiologic susceptibility to social context. We have studied it at the level of temperament and behavior, on into the cortisol and fight or flight reactivity of the central nervous system, brain circuitry and synapse and cells, and now on into genetic variation and epigenetic variation as well. So who are these orchid and dandelion children? Well, the dandelion children, in addition to being those who are low in reactivity, are often extroverted. They are very comfortable with novel situations. They have average health in both low and high stress settings. In contrast to the orchid children, who are often, though not universally, shy. They tend to withdraw from novel circumstances. They have these sensory hypersensitivities, like aversions to loud noise or certain kinds of tastes. And they have this phenomenon of having the best or worst health outcomes depending upon context. And most importantly, the two define the poles of a spectrum of sensitivity to the social and physical world. Where do orchids come from? Here's this new father talking to his newborn baby, saying, so how do you want to play this, nature, nurture, or a bit of both? Well, it turns out it is universally a bit of both. So the answer to the question, where do children, dandelion and orchid children, come from? They come first from genetic variation. It shows an unraveled chromosome down to the level of the double helix that we're all familiar with kind of the intermediate chromatin structure in between there. We know that there are probably hundreds of genes that are related to these profiles of high and low reactivity. But genes are interesting. They are like books that are packed in boxes. They have to be taken out of the box and opened and unpacked in order to be read and to affect the experience and phenotype of the individual. And that happens, it turns out, by virtue of the family and social context in which they're being reared. So it is neither just genes nor just environments, neither just nature nor nurture, but the combination of both that seem to affect whether a child becomes an orchid child or a dandelion child. And we now know in the most recent proliferation of scientific findings around these different kinds of children that we know exactly where this is coming from. It's coming from the epigenome. Epi is the Latin, of course, for on top of. It means like epidermis is the layer of skin that's on top of the dermis. The epigenome is the chemical matrix of chemical tags that lie atop the genome. The genome, we receive at conception. It is, at least at this point in human history, indelible from conception to death, and it does not change. But the epigenome can change moment to moment. And just like books in the box, it can be unpacked or packed, which affects the access of the decoding enzyme for that gene to that code that allows that gene then to be expressed. So a gene can be silenced or expressed depending upon the packing or unpacking at the chromatin level. That happens by virtue of these chemical tags, like this methyl group that lies atop an area of a given gene. And we know that the placement of these chemical tags is highly related to the social context in which children are being reared. So we now think of this epigenetic mark, as where the external world touches the biological self. What allows an orchid child to thrive? In our clinical work with these kids, we have found that both teachers and parents and others who work with children have found 6 different strategies that seem to enhance the life of orchid children and allow them to flourish. The parents' recognition and allowing of expression of that child's one true self. I think one of the major responsibilities of young parents is to recognize who this child is and to allow the flourishing and the blossoming forth of that child's one true self. Routines and sameness. All children like routine. It helps to have day-to-day, week-to-week repetitiveness in the things that are done in a child's life and within the family. It's especially true of orchid children. The Latin word caritas, which means steadfast love and attention. All children, of course, need their parents' steadfast love, but it is apparent that that kind of universal attentiveness is something that is crucially important to these highly sensitive children. Parents who allow the celebration of human differences and diversity seems to be an important strategy. Imaginative play, the child's holiday from reality. We tend to think of play as trivial and non-important. It is not. It is a crucial part of the child's experience, and play is where a child learns more about who he or she is and how to negotiate social interactions with other children. And finally, the balancing of fear with mastery, that decision that parents with an orchid child have to make of deciding whether to allow the child to withdraw from a fearful circumstance or push them forward a little bit, potentially allowing them to experience mastery and victory over that fearfulness. And this, of course, forms this nice little mnemonic of orchid. So, summary, children's health is not just affected by bugs and bad water. We know that these psychological adversities that we've been talking about, maltreatment, parent conflict, and so on, can impair health and even impede brain development. And children are not equally susceptible to those exposures. They seem to fall into 2 categories of susceptibility: a majority that, like dandelions, thrive under most conditions, and a small minority, about 1 in 5, that, like orchids, are especially sensitive to both the good and bad rearing conditions that they experience. And we now know that these differences in susceptibility are due to the combined developmental effects of genes and early environments. In other words, they are epigenetically mediated. So these 2 deep currents in my life though I really didn't discover this in any kind of a conscious way until maybe 10 years ago. These two deep currents are powerfully related to each other. It has been said that every photograph is a self-portrait, in the sense that everything that we choose to focus on in our career, our lives, is something that reflects on who we are internally as a person. The answer to the why and how question probably is that my sister and I had an unshared family environment. I like to say that no two children grow up in the same family. There are these different families that different siblings experience. There were probably differences in genetic risk between Mary and myself. We clearly had a difference in birth order and gender. And there were probably epigenetic interactions between that genetic variation and that unshared family environment. We are living now, all of us, in a time of resurgent disregard for the care and protection of the world's most tender and unpowered people. The defenseless, as you know, are mocked and bullied. The poor are blamed for their poverty. Refugees are turned away. And the lowly of the human species are all but ignored. And most of the time, it turns out that the most susceptible and the most sensitive of all of the world's people are the children that we raise within our families and our communities. But there is good news in this story, I think, and the news that I want you to remember are these points, that the children about whom we often worry most are sometimes those with the most remarkable promise. And under conditions of support and care, lives that we think of as troubled childhoods can give way into lives of enduring health, positive development, and astonishing achievement. So that is the story of the orchid and the dandelion, and I would love to have a discussion with you and take any of your questions. Thank you.
So in the slide about the neuron, where one was sort of more grown and the other one was not.
Yes.
Could you speak a little bit about the manifestations, if you know about it, in adulthood of those kinds of, like the cognitive manifestations and as well as like behavioral?
Yeah.
Maybe you can expand upon that.
Yeah. You know, we went through a period of time where we thought that all of neuroplasticity ended at about age 3. And we still believe that those first 3 years of life are a period of critical development in brain growth and peripheral neural growth. But we now recognize that there still is brain plasticity even into adult life. There is apparently, thankfully, even evidence of neurogenesis, new neuron formation, even in people my age. So there's this plasticity is not as great, but it extends for a much longer period of time than we originally thought. And by the way, it begins earlier as well. It probably begins at conception, and there are experiences that happen in utero that determine the things that are then going to happen to that child after birth. Important question.
So my question is about, are there any traits or any ways to determine if kids that you're raising, what kind of personalities they might have? I have 2 teenagers, very different in nature. And as I was hearing your talk, I can place them in either of the categories. It's still not clear to me how I would determine.
Yeah, well, you know, the way that we worked that out, of course, was to bring them into a psychophysiology lab and measure their reactivity to stressors that we presented to them. You're not going to do that. That's not something parents have access to. But over the years, we have seen that there are certain kinds of behavioral manifestations that seem to flock together among children who are either high or low in reactivity. And they are the ones that I mentioned. The kids who are Orchid children who are very high in reactivity tend to be kids who are shy, behaviorally inhibited. They are kids who don't like to go into new situations, like a birthday party where they don't know all of the kids, or a new class at the beginning of a school year. And they are kids who tend to have these sensory hypersensitivities. My wife and I had an orchid daughter and a dandelion son, who once were teenagers but now are almost 40. And thankfully both are thriving. But our daughter, the orchid, as a child, she just could not stand to have her socks wrinkled inside of her shoes. It was just a thing that just bugged her, and she couldn't get off to school or whatever she was doing without having those socks released from their wrinkles. So that's sort of a silly example, but these kids have these aversions to loud sounds, certain tastes, certain tactile kinds of experiences. There isn't one set of clearly defining behavioral manifestations that I could say, oh, that is an orchid child. But more often than not, we can tell by talking to a family about these differences that you're talking about, whether a child is an orchid or a dandelion. Yeah.
So I was wondering, when it comes to health outcomes, if you know, like an orchid child, quote unquote, makes it, does that result in like greater emotional resilience later in life? Like,
Yeah.
or does the like sensitivity to trauma persist?
Yeah. I would say that the susceptibility to trauma persists. It seems as though it's not something that goes away. But on the other hand, part of what I've wanted to convey to you is this extraordinary promise that young orchid lives have. They can look in the early years like very troubled children. And in fact, our daughter had a very difficult adolescence. But she's now a charge nurse at Oakland Children's Hospital across the bay. She's a very competent, very great nursing professional with two young grandsons of ours that she mothers beautifully. She's an extremely competent, successful person. So these orchid lives that can look troubled, especially early in life, can really blossom into lives that are truly exceptional, I think. But that vulnerability, that susceptibility to toxic stressors, I think probably persists for the remainder of life.
In talking about balancing the fear and mastery for
Yes.
orchid children, right? Because they're going to go off in the world and leave this great, loving environment you've created and need that tolerance. How do you kind of understand where to hit that sweet spot between giving them the amount of stress they can handle so they can start to master it, and not overwhelming them so their cortisol levels go high and then it becomes an ace?
Yeah. It's a really important and thorny question. I think one of the hardest things for parents who do have an orchid child is figuring out how to walk that very fine line between not giving in to their fearfulness, completely all the time, but actually sometimes nudging them on forward into experiences that actually do generate fear, but that they actually can master, and they can have this profound experience of triumphing over that fear when nudged into those situations. How you make the judgment of when to allow the fear to take over and when to allow the nudging to move them forth. Boy, if I had a solution to that, I could write a book that would be 5 times as successful as that one. But I think the best I can tell you is that as you get to know your child deeply, you begin to develop an intuition about what is going to be too much and what is going to be just enough to foster growth. It's a very tough line to walk.
Do things like ADD or ADHD and autism map to any of your information?
Yeah, great question. Because some of the things that I've mentioned that are part of the behavioral phenotype of kids who are orchids or dandelions overlap some with these psychological disorders. Being an orchid child is nowhere in the diagnostic and statistical manual of psychiatrists. It's not a named psychological disorder. But things like the aversiveness of certain kinds of sensory experiences, those are common in kids with autism, certainly. So it's an area of overlap, but there's no claim or anything here about thinking that an orchid child is a diagnostic category within a psychiatric framework. But some of the characteristics of orchid children do tend to overlap with known psychiatric syndromes.
All right, that's all we have time for today. Thank you again, Professor. Let's give him another round of applause.
Thank you. Thanks. Thank you.